I think it goes without saying that if there was a World Cup of popularity stands over Gaza, that South Africa would win by several miles. Not only the ICJ, but I believe that the kind of credit that South Africa has with the entire world, because, you know, the struggle for freedom from apartheid is still fresh in many people's memories. I mean, you might have been way too young, but I recall being a young student 40 years ago and being alerted to the fact that these people are gathering in front of Manchester University because they are supporting, the claim to freedom by the people of South Africa. And that was my very first political awakening, I believe. And it then snowballed, and I got to understand the politics of South Africa, the politics and the ideology of white supremacy, the kind of oppression and injustice delivered by such projects, which emanate from, Europe, essentially. I mean, these are colonial settler projects. But then, the struggles and the protests and the marches of the townships and the name Nelson Mandela, the Desmond Tutu, those became icons of the student movement here in the UK for so long. And by the way, in opposition of the official British government's stand. I mean, famously, Margaret Thatcher, who was then the Prime Minister, said that Nelson Mandela would never ever walk the streets of London and claimed that he was a terrorist. He was a terrorist. There were leaflets being given out by conservative members and activists and such up and down the country, saying that Nelson Mandela should be hanged. And so with that kind of credit, the euphoria that overcame the entire world, when Nelson Mandela was freed, and then the elections after which he became president, added to that credit the stand on Palestine and the statements made by Nelson Mandela, by Tutu, by other, fighters in against apartheid in South Africa. I think that it's fairly clear that South Africa today enjoys popularity around the world like, probably no one else has.
It's an interesting thing as you were chatting. I'm part of the so-called born free generation in South Africa, born post-democracy. I was born actually just before the elections, just a few months before. So it's a fascinating thing. In South Africa, there's always this sort of robust discussion and pushback between the young generation, us, and the old guard, the struggle stalwarts. But one of the things that is not a huge point of issue, in that we all agree, is that of the shared struggle of South Africa and Palestine. And it's been a fascinating thing. In South Africa, and I know it's not necessarily the case in other parts of the world, but the more popular stance for average South Africans, and I mean this outside of Muslim communities, is to be pro-Palestine. I can wear kufiya in the mall. I can wear kufiya to the movies. I can wear kufiya to any space. And sure, in certain circles it will pop up a few questions, but it's a normalized thing. I can debate in Parliament with the kufiya, and openly. In fact, the State of the Province address a few weeks ago, when I debated it, my opening remarks were about what's going on in the situation right now in Gaza, calling for a moment of silence. And that's completely normalized. So there is this long history we share. If you look at the history also of Palestine, 1948, it's no coincidence that in 1948, the South African National Party, the white supremacist party that implemented apartheid, was also voted, in inverted commas, because obviously it was not a free, fair election, came into power in 1948. So you see the history of South Africa run parallel almost to that of Palestine. And that's why there's that shared struggle.
Is that something that is, let's say, within the awareness and consciousness of the young South Africans? Or is that something incidental because you're interested somehow about Palestine or such? I mean, is this something that is part of the, let's say, education of young South Africans?
young South Africans often were accused of being apathetic. This is a problem the world over. Young people are not as involved politically, etc. And I don't think that about young South Africans. I think young South Africans are deeply political. Apartheid's not just in living memory. It's something we're always reminded of. And you get two different reactions to this. You get the reaction of, we're thankful, for the struggle, for our freedom. But more than that, you're getting a different type of reaction of young people in South Africa who are saying, we appreciate that you fought, but right now what we have as a lived experience is not enough. We have rampant youth unemployment. We have major issues of poverty. We have major issues around crime, around corruption. And many young people are actually saying that's not enough. That we fought for freedom politically. It has taken us so far, but we have a job to bring about economic freedom and economic opportunity. So young people are very politically active. They may be angry, they may be disillusioned, but they're very active. If you look at service delivery protests or community-based protests in most townships, in most areas, they're organized by young people. And not necessarily young people who belong to political parties, but young people who are saying, we know our rights. One thing South Africans know, it's our rights. We know our constitution. No one's going to impede on our freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of movement, all of that. We know those things. But it's about translating that. So I think that's why many young South Africans do have an opinion on Palestine, Israel. Some of them are very pro, some of them are anti, no doubt. And there's also another view, which I want us to talk a little bit about, is why are we focusing on international issues when South Africa needs so much more assistance? And that's a very...
How would you respond
That's
to that?
a very dangerous argument, right?
Because we have the same over here.
Exactly. Why you're not focusing on local issues. And it assumes that we can't do both. In fact, what it does is it plants us in a trap that's set by colonialism, by imperialism, that you must focus on you and not worry about others. As South Africans, we are products of what international solidarity can do. Our freedom was, of course, fought for on the ground through the armed struggle and other forms. But a big pillar, and one of the biggest, arguably, was the boycott, divestment and sanctions against apartheid South Africa. That brought the apartheid government to its knees. And so there's a great understanding in South Africa of the power of international solidarity. So it's there. It's about how we translate it into more meaningful work, but also understanding that they're not one or the other. We continue fighting local issues. We continue to create opportunities economically, but also we continue to create systematic processes to fight poverty while at the same time playing our role on an international stage. And I'll tell you what I said in a community meeting just a week ago. If we have a greater moral authority on a public international stage, it means we can seek more positive and sustainable foreign direct investment, not ones where we are the stepchildren in terms of economic or foreign policy, but ones in which we say, actually come and invest in the South African green economy. We have a problem of load shedding in electricity. Yeah. What can we learn from the UK? Because I know, for example, wind farms are a big success story here. What can we learn from you guys to bring into South Africa, not in a colonial big brother way, but to say, how are we equal partners? Yeah. And we can do that more when you have a greater standing on the international platform. So everything is linked.
It's it's fascinating hearing you say, all that you've said, but I'd like to pick out the BDS issue.
Yeah.
Because, I told you how, many, several decades ago, I was, standing there leafleting about,
See, you also fought for our freedom.
I'd like to think so. And that literally was my political awakening. I mean, that was the time when I started to delve into international politics, into colonialism, into, the role of Europe, particularly, in creating, South Africa. We saw the happy end of, but, we had America, we had Australia, we had New Zealand, and we almost have or had Israel.
Yeah.
But let's go back to BDS for a bit, because even Nelson Mandela in his memoirs, even those who struggled for freedom from apartheid, in their writings, they recognized that it was this global boycott regime that was brought by people. Essentially, it was by the students, the National Union of Students here in the UK. It was by movements across Europe,
Yeah.
in America, Canada, and the such, that actually brought the apartheid system. It delegitimized the apartheid system. I remember one of the biggest advents of that particular era was the cricket team tour, the English cricket team tour. Now that was a huge nail in the coffin of
The sports
apartheid.
boycott.
But we are now, it is as though we have learned nothing from history, and now we're seeing more and more countries, including our own, attempt to criminalize BDS. I mean, we've gone beyond well, it doesn't really make any difference. What's the difference of one can of Coke, for instance? But the thing is that, it's now coming to the criminalization of these attempts. I mean, we've heard about how many states in America now, employees who are employed by companies need to sign sort of a confirmation or a statement saying that they will never take part in or endorse or the such any BDS movement, which sounds ridiculous, but is unfortunately true. What do you think? What do you think the importance of such a movement for a case such as Gaza?
Let me say two things. The boycott, divestment and sanctions movement, BDS, if it wasn't powerful, why would the West react in the way it is now?
Very true.
In fact, it is because of its very power, in a non-violent massification kind of way. So many people ask us, and I know they'll do the same with you, what can I do about Palestine? What can I do about these issues? What can I do about what's going on in South America or in Sudan or in the Congo, for example? Huge, huge, huge humanitarian crisis there as well. And people say, well, can I go there? It's quite simple. Boycott, divest, sanction. And if there was no power to BDS, I can guarantee you right now, nobody in the Western world would bat an eyelid.
Absolutely.
But I mean, if people are being made to sign documents, if people are being monitored on their social media, if they have, being signed like all of these sort of contracts, it's quite clear that there's a power here. And it's very powerful in another way, because it is a it is militant in some ways, but it's a non-violent action. Because what can they do to us? We're just refusing to buy a good. We're advocating for an academic boycott, a sports boycott. What can they do to us? They can beat us in the streets, yes, but they're going to come across very badly, because it's not necessarily a passive form of resistance. I don't like those terminologies, but it is a way in which we pull the carpet out from under their feet. And if all of us boycott, and that's why I sort of did this whole dramatic gesture, of course it has power. One of the crippling elements for the apartheid South African regime was the sanction movement. And it was specifically because, you mentioned it was financial, yes, but also because of credibility. It became so unpopular to be associated with apartheid South Africa that nobody wanted to touch it. They were a pariah state. And that's what we need to do with Israel. That's what we need to do with a number of different political groupings around the world who have made it very clear that they're enemies of freedom, of progressiveness, of left politics, etc. And it's actually it's at the dinner table. It's a low-hanging fruit.
Well, I'll come to, obviously, to talk about Gaza and all the underlying or overlying issues. But before that, I noticed from your profile that you led a student movement. And the student movement was particular about student fees. Now, that's a big issue here in the UK. In fact, it's a big issue, I would suggest, across the Western world. I'm fortunate enough to be amongst the very last generations of those who benefited from free education system. But my children each graduated with a hefty, debt on their heads, sometimes to the tune of tens of thousands, which they might never ever settle. So tell me a little bit about this and what you're hoping to achieve, and tell me.
So in 2015, 2016, I was very privileged, I think, to be able to have been a part of a social movement called Fees Must Fall, literally, Fees Must Fall. And this was fundamentally important. It started at Wits University, which is where I was an elected student representative, but it grew in. And there's an important lesson here as well. The university system in South Africa is not as unaffordable as the UK or the US system, but we're very close to it. An average person in South Africa, especially like a middle-class person, what we call the missing middle, cannot afford it. Forget working class and the underclass. They cannot afford it at all. And government does have different bursary programs, NSFAS, etc. But it's not systemic enough. It covers a few people. And the universities are very autonomous, which is a good thing. But the negative side of that coin is that they were pushing forward extremely hefty fee increases. Yeah. And so we did all of our research, we tried to negotiate, and as in any power struggle, we were 2 students in a meeting, a university board meeting of like 20, 30 other people, and they were like, yeah, let's put it to a vote, which sounds democratic, but can never be because we were only 2 people, even though we had a merited argument financially speaking. So effectively they voted it down, and we said, well, what do we do now? True South African spirit, let's protest. But we thought differently about the protest, and this is why Fees Must Fall became very important and I think very popular. Ordinarily in South Africa, when you protest, there's a memorandum, we sing struggle songs, which remind us of O.R. Tambo, Winnie Mandela, all of these different struggle heroes who did the same thing. Then you hand over a memorandum, you wait for an answer. So we didn't want to do that because that was what was expected. Universities in South Africa, a lot of them are gated. And so what we did on the 14th of October 2015 is we woke up very early in the morning and we literally sat down in front of the gates of the institution. And it was a very literal understanding of what this fee increment would do. It would quite literally close the doors of higher learning. And our Freedom Charter, in 1955, the anti-apartheid movement came up with what we call the Freedom Charter. And one of the key tenets of that is the doors of culture and learning shall be open to all. And so it was an interpretation of the Freedom Charter to say, actually, it's not. And so we will sit here and we will refuse to move until someone listens to us, because we did all the research and as we checked everything the university said it needed the money for. It was over above that because it was well over inflation. It was at 13% at the time. And many people were very angry with us. They called us all sorts of names, radio interviews, etc., TV interviews. But there were also many others who came, and we started off as a very small group of people, I would say 15, 20. And they came and they said, well, why are you protesting? We said, well, this is what's going on. And I kid you not, many people, actually, I don't know how I'm going to pay my fees at the end of the year.
Wow.
Drop the backpack and sit down with us. And the amount of times that happened. We grew from 20 people to several hundred within the first few hours and days. By the Friday, we started the Wednesday. By the Friday, we had thousands of people with us. And then other institutions of higher learning, universities called us up. Same problem. We also can't afford it. What are we doing? Let's organize. And so when the country woke up a few days later, it wasn't just one institution or one university. The entire country, institutions of higher learning, were saying there's a problem here. And so we brought the country to a standstill, not because we were hooligans like we were called, but because we said education is a right. It is not a privilege. We as young South Africans born in a post-democratic era, we deserve a chance. And beyond deserving a chance, forget for ourselves, for the South African future, for the economy, for our families. And then the tide turned. Because South African people said, actually, no, that's right. We want young people to be educated. How are we going to solve our economic quagmire without skills, without opportunity in that way? And it became what is the largest mass protest or mass movement led by young people, for young people, post-1994. And it continued on. We got major victories, some losses as well along the way. We encountered police brutality, real issues, really, really difficult. But at the same time, we reminded not just South African society, but the world over, that institutions of higher learning, they don't exist for the sake of only research or, for the arbitrary. It was for young people, for students. And we reminded the world that we're here. And we're not just here to stay. We're going to decide and fight for the future that we want.
Amen. I mean, that's a message that I believe will reverberate through here in the UK, because, it's become utterly ludicrous to expect young people trying to gain an education to fork out, in the high thousands of pounds every single year, besides, their cost of living and if they need accommodation or food or transportation. I mean, it's something that, I think that the other day I read somewhere that on average, a student leaves undergrad education with a bill of something like £75,000, which is around $90,000. That's
unfathomable. Most people will spend their entire adult life paying that off. And one of the big successes of Fees Must Fall in South Africa. So that year, the president called us 10 days later of the country, and he froze all fee increments in the country, and then said, right, here's a commission, let's investigate free education, its feasibility. But effectively, and it's not a systemic win that we wanted, but what they did is they transferred this NSFAS funding system from a loan to a grant. So we have some form of free education for the poorest of the poor and working class people, and they increased the threshold. But, and I'll be very honest, in 2024, not 2-3 weeks ago, that same body is under administrative crisis because of underfunding, because of how it's run, etc., etc. So this is a reminder not only to those who are listening and watching at home, but to us, that it's not over. We need to continue pushing, and we need to link up. If we're doing this in South Africa, what are we doing to organize with UK students, with students in the US, in different parts of Europe? In Norway, for example, they have a form of free education. What can we learn from them?
I understand that South Africa will have its national elections on the 29th of May.
Yes.
What are the main issues that will be flagged by the candidates?
So this will be our 7th election. I know it sounds like a small number, but it was hard fought for. Yeah. So very, very important. It will be 30 years of democracy. And like I said, born free, so we're always the same age as the democracy. Big issues. I think foremost of everyone's mind is the load shedding issue, our electricity problem. For those who don't know, we have a problem in terms of not just generation, but we have a number of plants that go down for sometimes maintenance, etc. And then we'll have periods where we don't have electricity. So 2-hour sessions, 3-hour sessions, it depends. So that's one of the biggest, I would say, local issues. But of course, unemployment. If you look at the stats, it's harrowing. Out of 10 young people, 6 are unemployed.
Wow.
Structurally.
Wow.
Now that is a recipe for disaster. Of course, this is between 15 and 24 years. So there's another argument around education and all of that. But I'm trying to show you the level of crisis of unemployment, particularly amongst young people. So that's a huge issue. I would argue that actually may be number one, and then load shedding. Load shedding is key to that, because if we solve the electricity issue, it means industry and business can grow, so economic opportunity and economic development. And then another big issue is around crime, safety and security. It's an issue that's plagued the country for a very long time. And so many people think, we just need more police. This thing is far more structural. It comes actually from a history of violent colonialism, violent conquering. And also because it's 30 years versus hundreds of years of colonialism, decades of apartheid. So we're almost still climbing out of the hole, I would say, because we have political freedom. I've spoken about it. We have the Constitution. On paper, we have it all. We have some of the best climate justice rights. We have some of the best women's rights, etc., etc. But it's about that implementation element. And that's a big thing in South Africa right now. How do we translate all of these incredible things in the Constitution and legislation? How do we make it a lived reality for the masses, the black masses of our people?
How does the South African public react when it sees its country playing such a pivotal role on the international scene, making a case for the people of Palestine and the fight there against an apartheid system of sorts? How does that play with the general public? Do they respond to that positively? Do they see this as some sort of, maybe political posturing of sorts, maybe some sort of grand gestures that outweigh the actual position of South Africa on the world stage? How is that seen?
I think the majority of South Africans were very proud.
The majority.
Majority. And I say this because if you looked at social media and you looked beyond the traditional support base of the Palestinian cause, so many people said they were so proud to have South Africa represent them on an international stage. Everything I've just mentioned around the challenges, it seems so bleak sometimes. And just to have a win, and I know it sounds a little arbitrary or airy-fairy, but you know when we won the South African Rugby the World Cup, there was another moment of euphoria there to say, actually, there's some really good things here. But why it was important, and there's a few things, I'm going to get to the criticism in just a moment. Why it was important, it was a reminder of the moral compass that the African National Congress, who is the governing party, used to hold and should still continue to hold. So even when it is unpopular to do so, and I'll be very honest with you, Anis, there are major counter-revolutionary forces in South Africa who are now, because of the ICJ case, really making our lives difficult. They are very clearly trying to push a particular narrative that is not just anti-Palestine, but anti-progress, anti-transformation. And we're a real thorn in their side because we're a small player in terms of economics and all the others. But when we stood up on a world stage, we did something that all the Western powers, even our Muslim powers, they didn't do it.
I mean, no Arab country, no Muslim country, no one ever thought. I mean, it was almost comical to see, Arab leaders cheer on South Africa for its stand. Why didn't you do the same? Why didn't you? I mean,
but maybe it was more powerful coming from us. President,
I believe so.
Yeah, President Cyril Ramaphosa, who inshallah we will re-elect on the 29th of May. President Cyril Ramaphosa, even before this ICJ case, if people recall, it's all over Google, you can check it out. There was a meeting of the African National Congress and the leaders of government just at the beginning of the attack. And I don't mean October 7th, and I'll speak to that now, wearing Palestinian kufias, pledging solidarity with Palestine. And why I started off this discussion with you, reminding everyone that our histories have run parallel. A lot of people think it's electioneering. How can it be electioneering when we have actively supported Palestinian freedom since the very beginning? Yasser Arafat and Nelson Mandela were close friends and comrades. We are sister organizations with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. There's another whole argument about what they've done, not done, etc. That's another discussion. But the ANC has always supported freedom-loving movements all over the world since its inception, in fact, in 1912. That's why we were created. We were not created to necessarily contest government. The African National Congress was created in a fight against tribalism, a fight against white supremacy, and it grew to say, actually, it's not just black South Africans or black Africans in the country who must fight. And that's why you'll see I use this term, and let me explain it. In South Africa, blacks, it might sound derogatory to others, but it's not in South Africa. It's part of a black consciousness ideology that says we will embrace our blackness. And we talk about blacks in general. It includes those of African descent, Indian descent, what we call colored descent, so Malay slaves, etc., etc. This group, we actively identify as black almost as a form of resistance to whiteness, because we were always told that we were second-class citizens because of it. So we took back that narrative. So as the black masses, we said, no, we will take a stand. So that's one thing. But the other important thing around the ICJ case, and I was leading to this now, it cannot be an electioneering stunt when tens of thousands of people are dead. Millions have been displaced. Gaza is not on the brink of famine. They are in famine. I mean, they have been under a siege now for an inaudible amount of time. And so those who criticize us, we say, but how can you say that? It is a humanitarian crisis. And just because others are not doing anything does not mean we will sit down. We will not pretend that it's okay, because when we were in trouble, imagine Olof Palme, the late Prime Minister of I think it was Sweden. Imagine he said nothing. Yeah. Imagine you did nothing in your university years. I don't even think I would be born. I don't know where I'd be. So we must take that stand. And I want to be very clear, despite all of the attacks, despite everything, the African National Congress and the ANC-led government in South Africa, we will stand firm. And we will stare down the bully in the playground, and we will continue this fight. Because at the end of the day, the US never supported South African freedom, and the UK government, you mentioned Margaret Thatcher, never supported us. And yet, our freedom came, despite them. They sanctioned at a time when it was almost irrelevant. And it's not forgotten. Our leaders in government now, Minister Naledi Pandor, these are people who actively fought for South African freedom. That's why she's so firm, because for them it's not academic. It's their lives. Because nobody stood up for us except for the global South, and we will do the same for Palestine and other countries who need us to do it.
Will the national elections, will they figure Palestine?
It's going to be a tough election. In any free and fair democracy, I mentioned a number of those local issues, but it's an interesting election now, and I'll say so because Palestine has always been a popular issue, yes, but it's never been a fundamental voting point. In certain communities in South Africa, not all, it is a fundamental voting point. So the official opposition, the Democratic Alliance, is actively supporting Israel, is actively Zionist. This is a familiar story, is actively funded. Now, 2 weeks ago, their leader said, one person's freedom fighting is another's genocide. I mean, on national television. And it went down very badly in all circles in South Africa. And I'm saying this because so many people are saying, yes, there's all these local issues and we agree potholes are a problem, load shedding, water, etc. But that party doesn't represent my moral view on issues because Palestine is an example of it. Remember, it's almost at this point now. Like I said, late 1980s, it was very unpopular to support South Africa. We need to do the same. And it's happening in South Africa. So people are saying there are those issues, but I cannot in good conscience vote for the DA, the official opposition, because look what they did now. And I'll tell you why also, because their leader went to Ukraine when there was the war there. And so now everyone's like, you went to Ukraine, why are you not trying to go to Palestine? You've exposed yourself. You've exposed what colonial power sort of puppeteers you guys are. And I'll close on this point. The DA even wrote to Secretary Blinken in the US asking for assistance and intervention in a foreign country. That is treasonous. We are our own country. We have fought hard for this freedom. The US cannot come in and decide what the outcome of the election will be. That is for the vote. That is for the millions of South Africans to decide.
I mean, you might know that we also have our general election sometime this year.
Yes.
And the point that you make is extremely interesting, that Palestine per se might not be a focal issue within the voters' catalogue of challenges and miseries. We have a cost of living crisis. We have an inflation. We have, problem with rising crimes. You might hear or not that virtually every day we have a stabbing incident, if not more. We have a lack of trust in our police. We have, a catalogue of issues which people will definitely, taxation, a catalogue of issues which people are totally immersed in. And therefore, it's very difficult to see Palestine as being, within that array of issues that the normal, citizen of the country will be considering once voting. However, what you say is extremely interesting in that the argument is that someone who stood and watched whilst Israel absolutely obliterated the health sector in Gaza for 2.5 million people, and saw as the Israelis continued to shell hospitals with critically ill patients, children, babies, and yet do nothing or not even call for a ceasefire. How can that person be entrusted with our national health service?
And how can that person represent my views and my thoughts?
That point, I believe, is where, Palestine has become a benchmark.
Yeah.
It's not an issue per se, but it's a benchmark for everything else. So it talks of people's ability, their sort of capacity to actually lead, to actually hold positions of power and authority. And it is, when you think about it, it is quite dangerous to hand such power and authority to someone who saw a genocide being committed and yet failed to condemn, failed to speak out, failed to...
Or in other ways, actively armed. That's another very big issue.
And by the way, sometimes I publicly ask the question, do people not realize what has happened. I mean, the ICJ was I believe, it was a threshold moment. It was a transformative moment. Because what happened is that the ICJ decided, based on the case presented by South Africa, that there might be, it's plausible, that there is a case for genocide, which means that in whatever time it takes, years probably, to find in favor, hopefully, of the South African case. After that, anyone who encouraged, anyone who supported, anyone who stood by and did nothing, anyone who funded, anyone will be complicit in a war crime having been committed.
This is exactly what Minister Pandor and President Ramaphosa have spoken about. So one of the reasons there's been such violent opposition to the ICJ case led by South Africa is exactly that. Because it's not only Israel who is on world trial here. It is the United States, it is the United Kingdom, it is Germany, it is the EU and many powers that have actively, as I mentioned, armed, supported, apart from being complicit, that's one matter, but actively put guns in the hands of the IDF, who we know have indiscriminately killed women and children in particular, right? And that's no mistake. You want to kill the future of a people, you kill their women and their children first. So that's one of the reasons why we faced and we currently face such severe opposition from, I would say, certain powers, why they're now going to hold different elements sort of over our head, but also why I think you've seen a much harsher and stronger ANC of old almost. The kind of African National Congress that stared down, like I said, the big bully and said, no, we're not going to do that. Because today we're in favor, tomorrow we're out. In fact, this is the big one that we say, and I even said this in a diplomatic event recently, much to everyone's shock and horror. When we watch the TV screens or our phones and we see it on Instagram, all these different platforms, we identify with the people who are being killed. Even what happened with Russia. We identify with the oppressed. We don't identify with Israel or Western power because today it's them, tomorrow it can be us. We've seen this all over the world. Overthrown governments, civil war, and always, who are the ones who are hurt? It's people who look like us. It's people who come from the same backgrounds as we do. So of course we're naturally suspicious. Of course we don't actively support. We're not stupid. I'm not too sure why white supremacist thought things were so stupid. We're not. We see through it. So when you attack one of us, you're attacking all of us. And therein lies the true power of the ICJ case. Not just as a legal tool, of which it's fundamentally important, but almost win or lose. Whether Israel implements the measures or not, of course we want them to. We've exposed the hypocrisy.
Absolutely.
And we've exposed the double standards of international law. It doesn't apply to them, but it must apply to us.
I mean, this is something that, we've said, we've heard, we've echoed several times since that historic day when a country the size and position of South Africa stood before the entire global audience and for 6 or 7 straight hours outlined the case for Israeli genocide without being interrupted, without being diluted, without being filtered. And that's something that we've never seen before. And I delivered a speech a couple of days after, and I was asked about the impact of this and whether the ICJ will find in favor. And I said, listen, I don't really care because what has happened is already historic. Not only in terms of the exposition that was presented in such an eloquent legal language that cannot be penetrated or refuted, extremely objective, but also because the fact that the ICJ found it plausible, accepted the case on its merits, on its technical merits before its content. That means that no one who criticizes Israel today can fear being accused of being anti-Semitic. It's been done. We've crossed that bridge.
And in fact, I want to talk about that, this notion that anyone who is pro-Palestine is anti-Semitic. Let's defeat that right now.
Yeah.
In South Africa, we have had a number of Jewish members of our community, of our leaders who've come out against it. But beyond that, and I want to cite names like Ruth First, Professor Goldstein, all these different people who have actively, Ronnie Castrol's, fought against South African apartheid, who stand with us now. So this idea that we're anti-Semitic because we are fighting for freedom, not at all.
Absolutely.
We are exactly actually standing with many of the tenets of Judaism in terms of fighting for justice. And it's something I said in a community meeting also, that in the same way we must fight anti-Semitism, we will also fight Islamophobia.
Yeah.
Because the same places where those things were created set us up against each other. And to be very clear, we are anti-Zionist.
Yeah.
That's the view. So even when people try to level that accusation, I'm like, no, it's nonsense, come on.
Yeah.
If you understand how these two things work, that's where we stand. But more importantly, we are actually a living example in South Africa of Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Buddhist, secular people, atheists, who have stood together towards the cause of Palestine and also a free South Africa.
And if you're lucky enough during your stay in London to attend some of the functions and events which take place virtually every single day, you will find that the Jewish element within the pro-Palestine campaign is sizable.
Exactly.
And it's loud, and it's brave, and it's courageous, and it's principled. And added to the names that you mentioned, we have also in London, we have Andrew Feinstein, who's a South African Jew, who is absolutely at the very helm of the pro-Palestine campaign. And he is standing against the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, in his constituency in Holborn and Camden. And one of the stars of today, someone who's come to prominence because of his statements and the such. So, I mean, it's there's much to be said, but let's just make absolutely sure that we confirm that the issue of Palestine, that has, whilst geographically is on a plot of land that can't be seen on the global atlas. If you were to open the world's atlas, you wouldn't be able to actually see Gaza. But the impact of Gaza has been felt, at every corner of the world, everywhere. Because I've been in touch with pro-Palestine movements in New Zealand, in Peru, in Bolivia, in Australia, in Malaysia, everywhere around the world. And obviously South Africa is part of that. We are, maybe I don't know, I'm getting a little bit too optimistic in my old age, but is there a potential that young people like yourself who have experienced this without the luggage and baggage of the preceding 30, 40, 50 years, that you have the advantage of having that kind of set of values upon which we can create a different world? Because the way I see it, and this is my own internal struggle, the way I see it is that despite all our advancements, all our technologies, all our medical revelations, all our communication revolutions, humanity is at its worst in terms of mental illness, in terms of depression, in terms of we have more poverty than we ever had, we have more wars than we ever had, we have more conflicts that we ever have. So, I mean, do you talk amongst your peers and say that something else, something different, something better is possible?
I think your optimism may be better placed, actually, than what everyone else is saying. I think we come from a youth grouping in a generation that, and I know we annoy everybody. They call us woke and all sorts of things. And we annoy people because even at the dinner table, we fight for what we think is right. And so many people have accused us, this generation, instant gratification, they want things now. And the reality is, that's what makes us great. That fire inside of us that doesn't want to accept the status quo, that fire that took us to the streets in 2015 in South Africa for Fees Must Fall, that fire that even now young people all over the world, whether it's on Palestine, whether it's on climate justice, whatever the case is actively taking a stand, that is actually what makes us great. Because we're not afraid to talk truth to power. We get ourselves in trouble often, I know, whether it's in the private sector workspace, in our families, in our friendship groups, but we're not going to accept it. And we're also a generation that says mental health is important. And fundamental to mental health is justice. There's a reason why people are more depressed, people are more anxious. Look at the world. It needs a fundamental change. And we've always said that the people who are crazy enough to believe that the world can change often are the ones that do it. And it's not just us speaking in an airy-fairy tone. I learned this during Fees Must Fall. We did in a few weeks and months, maybe let's say a 2-year period, but within a few weeks and months, what we were unable to do as the whole student movement and labor, the labor unions in South Africa, then they could do for the last 25 years. And we did that, yes, because of timing in the right moment, yes, but also because we pushed so hard that even when they told us you would fail, we said it doesn't matter. We will fight to the very end. And what I learned, and it came straight from Allah, there's no way, it came straight there from there, that if your intentions are in the right place and your cause is just, you push with everything that you've got. Allah will find you on the other side. And that's what happened. So there is a feeling, I suppose, of invincibility of young people. But I think that was one of the best characteristics we have. And I want to urge young people who are watching this. There is a power that we have. We can change things. This idea that our votes don't matter, our voices don't matter, it's nonsense. If you look at your phone right now, we have access to information we never did. We have young people and people across the world who are exposing the genocide on TikTok, on Instagram Reels, on all of these different ways. So now Israel can't even deny what they're doing because we're seeing it firsthand. And who is the pivot of that generation in those issues? Us. So we're in a whole new world. Does it mean our enemies are bigger and more nasty? Yes. But it does also mean that we are more in terms of outnumbering them, but we have more tools than we have ever had before. Now it's not just about money and power. Power is represented in different ways. So I want us to remember that actually we are sitting in a position in which we can fundamentally change things, even if it's just public thought. Because when public thought changes, politicians change. Politicians want to be elected. We're going to a general election in South Africa, in the US, in India, in the UK, all over the world. There are big countries that are going to an election. What do politicians want? They want to be elected. If public thought changes, they too will change because they want those positions. So don't underestimate the power of your video or the power of your discussions in your school groupings, in your social groupings. All of that has the ability to change your world.
And, you know, poll after poll, whether it be here, whether it be across Europe, whether it be in America or Canada, are showing that age range between 18 and 32, 34 is way off the scales in terms of its support for Palestine, its understanding of the nature of the struggle that's going on, about their absolute animosity towards Zionism. I mean, these things are being discovered by the young, and they're turning away from what we still call, I believe, mainstream media. They're turning away from the BBC. They're turning away from CNN. They're finding their own means, their own sources of information. And for that reason, I personally say, and I don't think this is a conspiracy of any sort, why in America there is such a battle to ban TikTok, or to at least, if they can't beat it,
to manage
purchase it, you know, and pile billions in order to gain control of it. It has nothing to do with Chinese spyware, I believe. I think it has everything to do with it providing a channel for people to air their views, and those views are contradictory to what people have been educated, systematically educated for the past 50 years, my generation. I mean, one thing that I read that was posted by a young lady, I believe, in either Canada or in America, that said that, you know, that image of the grandfather in Gaza who was burying his granddaughter Reem, Ruh al-Ruh, the soul of the soul, and, you know, the tenderness that he showed as he was holding her dead body. She said something which was very interesting. She said in that 30-second clip that was totally unscripted, totally unorchestrated, basically an entire generation of misconceptions and stereotypes that defied reality were shattered. Because all of a sudden, this image of a man in a turban with a bushy beard, in a thobe, in a totally non-Western garb, that person wasn't bloodthirsty. That person wasn't vicious in terms of character. That person wasn't rough and tough and sort of intimidating. That person was the epitome of humanity, of compassion, of love, of tenderness. And that is precisely what I personally think the establishment, wherever it may be, is trying to fight. Because, people's preconceptions are being transformed. They're being transferred into another realm. And that's something which I believe defies what the establishments want.
I fully agree with you. Long gone are the days where the archetypes of what they wanted us to look and feel like. Long gone. Because we have our own voices and we have the ability to get our message out there. Yes, there's shadow banning and all these different things, and we need to fight against it. But I agree with you. I think there's only so far in terms of logical conclusion that they can take certain things because people are not stupid. I know that. I keep saying this, but I must repeat it because it's almost as if, as you said, the institutions have forgotten. When people see such a heart-wrenching image or video of that, I mean, it's human. And the biggest success they had was to dehumanize all of us, to dehumanize Palestinians, to dehumanize the fight against settler colonialism, to be like, these people deserve it. They deserve to die. They're animals. And we're not. And I'm saying we very intentionally, not because I'm of Palestinian descent, but because, like I said, we see ourselves in them. That when we stand together as a global South, as an oppressed peoples, both historically and currently, there is no person with some sort of a heart or some sort of something in them that can be okay with what's going on. And that's why they must ban. That's why they must manage it. It's why they must take the messages off. It's why they must fight so vehemently. The boycott, divest, and sanctions movement. Because if we all stopped buying a particular product, let's be clear, if we all really did stop, even if you want to take this litmus test in the Muslim world, which I don't want it to be, because we know this is a humanitarian issue, you'd collapse. You'd collapse the company. I mean, we've seen it. We've seen those things. So their power lies in divide and conquer. Their power lies in that sort of fake news and the peddling of it. And I also want to say one last thing, given that all of us are going to an election season or are in election seasons. You're going to see a lot of noise. And they're going to see a lot of, I'd say, mess and sort of nonsense. And it's intentional because they want to make it difficult for our message to come out. So they will pile your phones, your information, everything on TV, everything you're watching with a lot of different types of propaganda on both sides. And we have a duty as people who love freedom all over the world and progressive thought and progressive philosophy. We have a duty to sift through that, but also to not fall into those traps. So utilize that information, go the extra mile to check, but also remember you are voting in an election time in which the world is at a turning point. So we can choose to go one way or the other way. I know I'm reductionist a little bit in this way, it's nuanced, it is, but we have a unique moment to vote in different kinds of governments. Governments that may not always represent all of our views, but governments that should represent our moral thought and character. And so the South Africans, I've said it before, the ANC has all of its flaws, yes, but it is still the best in terms of moral fiber and the ability to transform South Africa back into the hands of our masses, beyond white supremacy. The same thing exists here in the UK. You have the power to change that because they can't rig every election. They can't do it. But if all of us stand together and we say, this is how we're voting, this is what we're going to do, even if we turn Parliament on its head, there's significant power in that. Yeah. And we're at a point where we can change things beyond just being on the streets.
You're in London for just a few days, but what are you hoping to do? What are you hoping to send in terms of a message to those whom you're meeting with?
I'll be meeting with a number of MPs, as well as a former minister in Canada. The topic actually is around sexual harassment in the public service, especially of young women, which is a whole big issue that nobody is really talking about. You know, it creates a number of barriers to enter politics, which is one of the problems why many young women in particular don't. But my message is quite clear. All struggles are linked. In the same way we fight misogyny and patriarchy in the public service in Parliament, we must also stand for justice. We must fight for climate justice. We must fight against fight for the eradication of poverty. And we must, in the same way, ensure that our foreign policy is reflective, number one, of our people. But number two, like I keep saying, you can't think that this is far away, it's not going to affect us.
Yeah.
All of these issues are linked. And until we understand how holistic and how shared struggle is intersectional, we won't be able to move forward.
Fasiha, thank you so much. That was fantastic.
Thank you.